All right. Welcome to Module 2, sort of the official beginning of the project management section of the course. We're going to begin our journey, which will ultimately go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. But before we get too deep, let's start with an introduction to project management. Now, given that this is an intro, I suspect there may be a few of you who have sort of an idea for at least the surface details of what project management is. If you don't, that's totally fine. But this lecture is really designed to simply get us all up to the same level of understanding for projects and project management before we get too far down the rabbit hole and before you guys ultimately end up working as a team together on a massive project. So that said, today we'll be covering what are the project management basics. What is a project? What is project management? What are the stages of project management? Why project management is important? And lastly, what do project managers do? By the end of Module 2.1 here, the idea is that you should have an understanding and an ability to identify core project elements, including goals, timelines, and stakeholders, summarize feedback and challenges from a past project, document and assess project outcomes from the past project using sort of a provided Post Mortem Worksheet. That's going to be included in your lab after this lecture in Canvas, so you should be sure to follow up with that. I also want to make sure that you guys are able to identify and assess the role of a project manager in that same past project that you guys are going to be looking at, and maybe even propose some improvement recommendations to enhance project efficiency, team collaboration, and maybe even some stakeholder buy-in. So, delivering projects on schedule, on budget, and ideally aligned with business goals is really the key to gaining an edge in this really highly competitive, really global business environment that we all work in this visual media environment. This is why it's important for the person in charge of the project to have a really comprehensive understanding for project management, from basic concepts to really extensive experience in some cases. Project managers have an incredibly complex assignment that sort of blends organizational skills, analytical thinking, and just even some really adept interpersonal abilities. And this class is going to build on a lot of those interpersonal abilities too. Many project managers are assisted by some project management softwares and tools that help projects throughout the project lifecycle. So in this section, we'll discuss the basics of project management and what that means to be a project manager. Before we get into the basics, we need to first define what exactly a project is. Sure, you've probably been assigned countless projects in school or maybe even on the job, but what is the actual definition of a project? The Project Management Institute, or PMI, defines project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. There are a few things to notice in that definition. The word temporary. Temporary means projects must have a defined beginning, middle, and end, right? Particularly a beginning and an end. This means that every project must include a timeline and thereby a scope and maybe even some resources. The fact that a project is temporary with a beginning and an end also means that it's not part of any sort of ongoing operations, which brings us to sort of our second point. The purpose of a project must be to create a unique product, service, or result. This means a project will be started to accomplish a specific goal outside of day-to-day business operations. And the project team might include people who don't maybe always work together. And maybe it'll require some outside resources or resources that are outside of the scope of day-to-day operations. A couple of things that a project, really every project must have, are some of these components. Start with a goal. What is it that you are trying to achieve with this project? You might also have a timeline. When are you trying to achieve it by? Budgets are really important for a lot of projects. How much do you suspect that it's going to cost to achieve that? Most projects also have stakeholders. Basically, a good definition of a stakeholder would be, who are the major players who have an interest in this project? Maybe sometimes it's a CEO or something like that. Sometimes it's just team members. Fun fact, a client or a customer or a user could even be a stakeholder. And then sometimes you would have a project manager, someone who is going to make sure that everything that needs to be completed gets completed. And other times that role of a project manager is kind of rolled into other responsibilities as well. Something really important to note here, a project is not something routine. Day-to-day operations and maintenance are not considered projects because they do not have a definitive start and end, right? You're kind of doing those ongoing into the future. So now that we know what a project is, then what is project management, right? Project management is really just the practice of applying knowledge, skills, tools, and specific techniques to complete a project according to specific requirements. And this definition, according to Reich, is sort of a popular project management tool that's used out there. Proper execution of this practice comes down to really identifying the problem, creating a plan to solve the problem, and then executing that plan until the problem has ultimately been solved. And that may sound simple, but there's a lot that goes into it at every stage of the process. And with the proper project management plan, the project will be completed hopefully on time and within budget. That's really the stakes that we're working with there. The roots of project management can really be traced as far back as sort of building the pyramids in Giza and the Great Wall of China. However, the modern development of this practice really began in the 19th century when railway companies were purchasing tons and tons of raw materials and employed thousands of people to work on the transcontinental railroad. And then by the early 20th century, Frederick Taylor applied project management concepts to the everyday work and sort of developed strategies for working smarter and improving inefficiencies rather than demanding that laborers work harder and longer. From there, a guy named Henry Gantt, who was an associate of Taylor's, sort of took those concepts and used bars and charts to graph when certain tasks, or even just a series of tasks, were to be completed. And this created a completely new way to visualize project management. Then, during World War II, military and industrial leaders were employing even more detailed management strategies, eventually leading to more standardized processes like the critical path method. And the precursors of what came to be known as the critical path method were actually developed and put into practice by the company DuPont between 1940 and 1943. And then a very similar method to the critical path method ultimately was used to manage the Manhattan Project during the development of the atomic bombs, which sort of unfortunately devastated the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but have now become very popular in movies like Oppenheimer. These practices grew in popularity across several industries, and in about 1965, the International Project Management Association was formed. Following that, the Project Management Institute, or PMI, was founded in 1969. And then in 2001, agile project management methodologies were sort of codified by the creation of what we now call the Agile Manifesto. And the Agile Manifesto, which is pictured here on the right in what would sort of appear to be a website that has not been updated since its inception in 2001, is still, as a matter of fact, the website. If you type in agilemanifesto.org today, this is what you get. However, the manifesto, it contains 4 values and 12 principles, which are sort of found on this website here. And the foundation for every iteration and branch of Agile project management that we still use today, over 2 decades later, are all what we're going to be looking at in this class. The field of project management and the term project management itself sort of continues to shift. The design and tech industries are becoming an increasingly more competitive landscape, especially as the need to deliver and to iterate on projects quickly becomes so much more critical to the success of businesses and organizations that we all ultimately go on and work for. And as new technologies like automation and artificial intelligence and 3D printing and the likes sort of begin to enter the consumer market on a global scale, we're also seeing a shift in project management just because of those things. Now that we sort of have a handle on what a project and what project management is, we can sort of start going deeper into some of the basics, such as the various stages of project management. There are really 5 project management groups or stages, and those are number 1 being initiating, and the goal of this phase is to really just define the project. What is it that we're doing here? And then number 2 is planning, and this phase includes developing a roadmap for everyone to follow throughout the project. Number 3 is executing, and so in this stage, the project team is sort of assembled, and you build the team and figure out deliverables that you're going to be creating as a team. Stage 4 is monitoring, and while the project is being executed, project managers will also simultaneously monitor and measure the performance of that project just to ensure that it's staying on track. So really, stage 3 and stage 4 are kind of happening in tandem together, so they're not linear, they're sort of cycling together. And then stage 5 is closing. At the end of the day, like we said, every project has to be completed. And once the project is completed, you typically hold what is called a post mortem, and it is transferred to another team to sort of maintain it if it becomes an ongoing project or it gets managed within some sort of data asset manager or some sort of storage drive. Don't worry, I can sort of already hear all of you saying all of this is great, but why is it important to me as a designer or someone working in the visual media industry? Well, there are numerous types of project management, which we'll get into some of those in some future lectures here, but more often than not, us visual media industry professionals often serve as project managers in addition to our more creative roles. Some projects might have dedicated project managers, but many times, more often than not, stakeholders tend to look to us to do some of that work, or all of it. So project managers help organizations have a more predictable project planning and execution process. We also adhere to project budgets and schedules and the guidelines and scope of the project. Project managers also help resolve roadblocks in the project and maybe even escalate issues quicker and easier. We also try to identify and terminate any projects that really just don't have any relevant business value. We help teams become more efficient. We help improve collaboration across and within teams. And we also look to identify and plan for risks before they even happen. Or if they do happen, then we try to mitigate those risks. In short, project managers are responsible for the planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and completing of projects. So they must have a really strong understanding of the subject matter. However, that's really just the tip of the project management iceberg here. So here, we'll cover 9 of the primary responsibilities of project managers, starting with building the plan. Project managers are responsible for plotting the most realistic course for the project. The plan really has to include the project's scope, timeline, and budget, but it can also include things like identifying the right tools for the job. Then you can focus on assembling the team. Identifying the proper team is critical to a project success, and every project team will really vary depending on the scope of the initiative and the functions needed to complete the project. So finding specialists and subject matter experts for each industry task is usually ideal. And then assigning tasks. Project managers must provide their team with very clear definitions of specific tasks and timelines for every part of the project. Although each team member will ultimately be responsible for their own assignments, many tasks require internal and external collaboration or sometimes even dependencies on roles that come before them. Project managers also lead the team. Now that the team has sort of been assembled and their tasks have been assigned, the project manager must keep the machine sort of well-oiled, sort of covering the basics and beyond. This will generally include checking in on individuals for status updates or identifying and clearing some of the roadblocks that they might have. Maybe you have to step in and negotiate some disagreements and just work to keep the team morale high, and maybe sometimes provide training and mentoring for the team as you go through the project. We manage budgets. I know budgets are not the most fun, but most projects will require some expenses, which means understanding how to create a project budget and manage costs is critical for success. This will typically involve comparing real-life expenditures to estimates and really adjusting the project plan if necessary. We manage timelines. As with the budget, project managers are tasked with keeping everything on schedule. So the team needs to meet its projected completion deadlines. And this will require setting realistic deadlines throughout the project's life cycle, communicating consistently with the team for status updates, and really maintaining a detailed schedule. And then we engage stakeholders too. Stakeholders play a large role in your project. They are typically influential people who are affected by the project. And project managers need to maintain good relationships and an open line of communication with all stakeholders who can not only help clear roadblocks and empower your team, but they can also create unnecessary bottlenecks and maybe even derail a project if they become sort of unhappy with the direction that your team or the project is headed. And then handing over the project. Just because project's objectives have been delivered doesn't mean that a project manager's job is over. The project manager sort of has to deliver the project to the team who will ultimately be managing or maintaining and sort of operating it moving into the future. So at this point, the project manager may no longer be the go-to person and might be assigned to a new project, but they're still responsible for making sure that that team that's taking on the project has what they need to continue forward without them. And then documenting the process. This is probably everyone's least favorite part of the process, but identifying and documenting sort of your lessons learned is a really good practice for personal growth and sort of relaying that experience to other teams around the organization to use in the future. And this will really help others avoid making the same mistakes or help future team members take advantage of the shortcuts that you discovered along the way. All right, that's it for today's topic, but be sure to check Canvas. There should be a lab right after this lecture. Be sure to complete that by the due date scheduled in Canvas. Just as a reminder, no late work is accepted. It doesn't matter if you're 2 minutes late. Those labs are designed to be completed in about an hour or maybe less. if you really put your mind and focus on them, you can get them done pretty quickly. In our next lecture, we will be covering some of the various project management methodologies that we typically see and use in the graphics industry. And this will be when we dive into sort of the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of project management. So we'll see you back there.